Welcome back to From the Belly. I'm Doug Wheeler, and as I say each episode, this is my podcast, and I'm awful proud of it. I really am proud of so far the guests that we've had, the content. We're getting some comments from different people. If you're listening in, we know you're not live, so that relaxes us a bit because we don't have to man the phone if we were to get any calls. But I handpick each guest, as I've said in prior episodes. Apart from the one that I did for the local church that I attend, I find my guests on Facebook and I reach out, and I think I've got maybe about probably 50% or more, maybe 60% of the people that I reach out to are at least willing to have a Zoom call with me. And once we get that accomplished, it seems like it rolls right into that we do a podcast. This one today was handpicked because one of my guests today, who I go to church with, and we have a young friendship, but I really respect Don Watson. I'm going to read a little bit of his bio in a moment. I asked Don to join me because I knew that he would be able to contribute to the conversation. Also, because he's the one who introduced me to Alan. He had sent an article that Alan currently wrote. We can talk about that article, but right after I finished the article, I said, I'm going to reach out and I'm going to find Alan Bean, and I'm going to see if he would like to be on my podcast. That's the way it happened. So once it happened, I thought, well, I got to bring Don into it because I never would have met Alan if it wasn't for Don. So Don graciously said yes, so that's how we come to the table. Let me say a few things about Don Watson. Don is a lifelong active lay member of the church and the American Baptist Churches USA. His 40-year career in education was centered around 30 years teaching middle school math, mind you, in the same building for 30 years, before several more years in part-time roles. And Don and I attend First Baptist Church together in McMinnville, Oregon. These are Don's words. Growing up in very white Salem, Oregon, what I knew of racial tensions came from the news. When I was a senior in high school, I was 66 and 67, I selected the book Black Like Me, a book written by John Howard Griffin, published in 1961. He did that for a book report that was required. Don says, reading that book opened my eyes and caused me to have passion for folks struggling for racial and economic justice. Just today, I went looking for information on that book that I read 58 years ago. And I did not know that the author, again, John Howard Griffin, died at the age of 60 in Fort Worth, Texas. So that says a little bit about Don, and maybe you'll learn more as we talk. So Don, I consider Don today as he's co-hosting this with me. That's the way I think of it, but also will participate. As I mentioned, Dr. Alan Bean is with us, and wow, this is going to be a really rich hour. Since 2000, Alan has served as executive director of Friends of Justice, an organization that creates a powerful synergy between grassroots organizing, civil rights advocacy, the legal community, and the mass media, and ultimately the political establishment. Friends of Justice is committed to building a new moral consensus for ending mass incarceration. Dr. Bean has been quoted extensively in leading publications such as Newsweek, The Washington Post, U.S. Today, Monde, am I pronouncing that correct?
Le Monde, yeah.
Le Monde,
French
the Chicago Tribune, and CNN. His work with Friends of Justice has been featured in the religious media outlets such as ethicsdaily.com, and he writes a monthly column for the Baptist News Global. And that's the article that Don had sent to a few of us at church, and I'd never even heard. I'm new to the American Baptist space or denomination. I'd never even heard of the Baptist News Global. Alan is the author of Taking Out the Trash. Is that Tulia, Texas?
Tulia, that's right.
Tulia, an insider account of the events surrounding the Tulia drug sting. A reviewer wrote about the book, in quote, one sense is that Dr. Bean has been an honest broker, and that despite the locale and feeling of dusty streets around you, it's the story of how most people in this country feel about those tagged as criminals. So that's Don Watson. That's Alan Bean. People know me. So let's launch right into it. Alan, why don't you tell us about Friends of Youth? Maybe the story behind how it started, what's been its journey, what is it currently, what are you up to these days? And then we're going to shift the topic and we're going to talk about mainline churches and I'll remind everybody listening, the topic of this season of From the Belly is why not church, or maybe why church? I think it's a question that the church needs to ask. What are we doing and why are we here? Sitting in a circle on Saturday, and a person was speaking with a lot of experience going to Christian schools and going to churches, and he unpacked what he thought the church ought to be, and I was in really full agreement with it. And he ended it, it really stood out to me the way he ended it. It was like a speech he gave, very passionate. And at the end he said, if we're not doing this, then what are we doing? And it really stood out to me. I thought, yeah, that's really true. If we're not doing this, this was taking care of our community, taking care of the people inside the building, keeping and holding and stoking the fire of the Jesus story. If we're not doing that and we're not relevant to the world, then why are we doing this? Why are we even meeting? So I appreciated that. I'm going to be quiet now and let Alan tell us about Friends of Justice. Welcome, Alan, by the way. Welcome, Dawn.
Oh, it's good to be here. Friends of Justice got started in 2000, actually 1999. My wife and I and our 3 children had been in Wichita, Kansas. First, I was in an American Baptist church there, and then I was a United Methodist pastor for a while. Then my father-in-law, who had been an American Baptist pastor in Idaho and then had gone to First Baptist Kansas City, Kansas, had retired. And my wife's family is from the Texas Panhandle, a little town called Tulia, Tulia, which is about halfway between Amarillo and Lubbock, if that helps. And we had just decided to make it a family reunion. Nancy's sister moved out from Tennessee, and we came down from Kansas, and Nancy's parents came down, and we all bought homes, and everything seemed to be going really well. My wife got a job teaching. And then there was a massive drug bust. 47 people arrested, almost all of them African American, and those who were not Black were romantically or involved with someone who were married to them. And so the drug sting had been in the works for 18 months. All of the cases were based on the uncorroborated word of one undercover agent named Tom Coleman. And at first we thought the whole thing was legit, but we were just offended by the way the people were dragged out of their homes, usually very modest homes, before they even had a chance to dress. Their hair was uncombed. They looked kind of bleary-eyed and confused. And all of this was captured on local media, especially in Amarillo. And we were offended by that. And then the local newspaper had an editorial that said that Tulia's streets had been cleansed of garbage, which is where the title of my book came, Taking Out the Trash in Tulia, Texas. So Nancy's father, who knew Tulia really well, realized since all the names and addresses of the defendants were published in the paper, he noticed they were all in the south end of town. He said they're all living in Blacktown. And so we decided to drive down and talk to some of these people. And when we talked to them, we heard a very different story from what we were listening to in the radio. We talked to some of the attorneys who were representing some of the defendants, and they told us this was the shakiest drug bust they had ever heard. The evidence that had been put forward against the defendants should not hold up in court, but probably would, because the juries were going to be almost all white and the defendants were almost all Black. And so that's the way it worked out. Tom Coleman would get up in court and say, this guy sold me a little 8-ball, which is a little plastic baggie full of white powder of cocaine. And then I drove up to Amarillo and booked the cocaine in, and everything was legit. The problem was that you just had to take his word for it. He didn't have where he had gotten that little baggie. We had no idea. Eventually, the drugs were tested and found to be about 10% pure. He was just taking a little bit of real cocaine, sometimes maybe even ground up crack cocaine, and mixing it in with baking powder and whatever else he could come up with. But nobody knew that at the time. We started writing letters to the editor and organizing. We got a Texas paper that was kind of famous for doing investigative journalism. to come up and do a story on what was happening. And that was published. And eventually the word started getting out. And then we initially got a lot of media interest from the New York Times, Los Angeles Times. But the fact was the people were convicted. The first guy to go to trial was a guy named Joe Moore, who was an elderly black man with very bad knees and all kinds of medical problems. And he was given 90 years. And then the next couple of people came to trial. There was a young black man with a young white man with a black wife who had been, since his days as a track star, had basically been hanging out on the black end of town because that's where most of his friends were. And he was given 6 consecutive 99-year sentences. And so a very strong statement was being made. And when that happened, everybody started taking plea deals, 15 years, 20 years, 45 years, whatever. Whatever they offered you was bound to be better than what you'd get at trial. And so then the media interest died down, as media interest will. And so we had to work really hard. We had a Never Again rally in Tulia, where we brought in a bunch of activist folks from Austin and various other places. And we brought in speakers. Most of the speakers were involved in the drug policy reform movement. And eventually, we were able to attract the attention of the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP. And Vanita Gupta, who eventually became the number 2 person in the Department of Justice under the Obama administration, came to town. At that point, she was just recently graduated from law school. And she managed to get a couple of international law firms from DC and New York to take up the cases. And then we had a whole different ballgame. And then Bob Herbert, who at that point was writing columns for the New York Times, wrote 16 consecutive columns about what was happening in Tulia. And then there was just a feeding frenzy. Eventually, there was an evidentiary hearing in Tulia. A judge was brought in, and the evidence was laid out in a week-long hearing. Tom Coleman basically exposed himself as a racist, and the judge concluded that he was simply not credible under oath and threw out all the cases, all the convictions. And that was, I thought, the end of that. There had been a whole lot of drama involved in what we had done.
How long? It
was about a 3-year period, from about 2000 to about 2003, when everyone was released. And then, but what we found was that people started, we didn't get a lot of media attention, my name or the Friends of Justice. By the time it hit the New York Times, we were kind of small potatoes. But we got enough attention that we started getting requests for help. And so we got a request from a family, the Colomb family in Church Point, Louisiana. A mother and 3 of her sons in the Black community had been accused of running a drug ring out of their little home. And so I went down and investigated that at their request. And eventually we managed to get that case overturned. And what we found was that the defense attorneys weren't really taking the case seriously, largely because they knew that they always lost. I kind of compared them to professional wrestling. There's a kind of professional wrestler called a jobber, whose job is to get in the ring and get his tail beat, and he moves around from territory to territory, just giving the star somebody to beat up. And that's the way defense attorneys tend to be in these drug cases. So one thing led to another. There was another big case in Jena, Louisiana, where 6 black boys had been accused of beating up a white boy in the high school. I came in and did some research and found out that this was just the last episode in a long story that had been brewing for a long time, and that several of these black athletes had been beat up by white kids in the past, and that there had been a fire in the school, and everybody was just allowed to come back after the fire, and racial tensions were really high. Nooses had been found hanging in the tree in the courtyard of the school. And so that is what sparked the violence. And it was a very regrettable incident. The young man was briefly hospitalized and then released. And at that point, it wasn't a guilt or innocence issue. The question was whether you were just going to look at that narrow focus or look at the whole narrative. And that's what I brought to the table. Was I wrote the narrative. Again, we were able to bring in some good defense attorneys, and the Southern Poverty Law Center got involved, which they don't usually do. And we got a lot of media attention. Al Sharpton got involved, and one thing led to another. Jesse Jackson. It became kind of a cause célèbre. And eventually, 50,000 people, almost all people of color, made the trek to this little isolated 3,000 person town in north central Louisiana. So many people came, they couldn't all get into town. There were just buses, mostly from churches, black churches.
Now, what year was that, Alan?
That was about 2007. Yeah. So, and then we did the Curtis Flowers case in Winona, Mississippi. Curtis had been convicted 6 times on the same of murdering some people in a furniture store in Winona. And so I did a lot of research and background and just kind of took the case apart. And then we got a podcast, of all things, from Minnesota Public Radio came in and spent a year on the ground researching this case.
Goodness.
And basically just following up on my leads, they did even more research. And eventually the case was thrown out by the Supreme Court, and Brett Kavanaugh wrote a scathing opinion saying that everything had been done wrong. Jury selection was the big issue. And they were able to contact some of the witnesses who had testified against Curtis, and they admitted that they were lying under oath because they were being offered favors by the prosecutor. And so all of these things unfolded over a period of years, but that's how we got into it. And it was something that I never intended to spend, 20 years, 25 years doing this, but that's the way it's worked out.
And I'm sure you have some comments or questions. I sure do.
Well, first of all, Alan, I just want to commend you and your wife and your team for not only noticing an injustice, but be willing to do something about it. It's just inspiring. Just found out about your book after Doug helped us connect. And I haven't read the book, but I've read the intro and looked at your table of contents and whatnot. How about just a little bit about the organization and how many people joined you and how did you fund this? A little bit of background on that.
Well, Friends of Justice started out as a Sunday night gathering at the Bean home in Tulia. We now live in Arlington, Texas, but at that time we lived in Tulia. And we would have anywhere between 10 and 35 people. We'd get together. Most of these people had a background in the Church of God in Christ, which is a Black Pentecostal denomination. And so we had the faith connection. So we'd sing and we'd pray and we'd read letters from prison and things of that sort. And we decided to call ourselves the Friends of Justice. Eventually, when we moved to Arlington, and we did that largely because I wanted to be close to DFW Airport. So because of travel reasons, it was difficult to travel from such an isolated community in West Texas. But when we moved here, eventually I got an office and hired some staff and some interns. And I started taking guided tours of the Mississippi Delta and places like that, and partnering with other people who were veterans of the civil rights movement and what have you. And then our funding ran out. We were basically grant funded. We got some fairly good funding from the Ford Foundation and a few other foundations, but it's very difficult in the advocacy world to keep funding. And so then at that point, it was just basically me. And I started just doing narrative campaigns. That is, I'd research a case and I'd blog about it. I'd do blog posts about the case. For instance, last year, I did a case for a guy named David Black in Washington, D.C., who had been convicted in the late 90s of shooting an elderly Asian woman in downtown Washington. And I had to do a whole lot of research on that case. And eventually, I was able to take it apart to the point where he was released from prison. And now he is working for his exoneration. He wants to clear his name and get the conviction overturned. And so I'm talking to the attorneys about that. Sat in on a virtual hearing last week in connection with that case. I'm working on a couple of other cases in a similar capacity, which usually requires looking through hundreds and hundreds of pages of legal documents and talking to people and interviewing people. And it's very laborious, but it is a skill set that I've developed over the years. It would be very difficult to teach anybody else to do it. You have to know how to frame the issues. You have to know how to distinguish between things that would hook reader interest and things that are just too arcane and complex to hold the interest of the reader. And so you're packaging the case, you're messing with the facts, but you're presenting the facts in a reader-friendly format. And if you don't do that, you don't get anywhere. And so that is what I've been doing. I've been writing for Baptist News Global for probably 10 years now. And for several years, I was doing a weekly interview with a Black radio station out of Alabama, which was kind of interesting. Eventually, just because of financial constraints, I started working as a hospice chaplain. And then after retirement, we had grandkids. And so I just try to use whatever spare time I have to work on the various cases that I'm working on. So that kind of brings you up to the present time.
Alan, how many cases would you say, you might even know the exact number, since 2000? Since you and your wife's name is Nancy, I think
Yes.
I heard you say, since the two of you marched into this, how many cases, that's 25 years, how many cases have you done this kind of archaeological dig on?
Probably 15 to 20.
Okay.
Some of them fairly minor, some of them on three occasions. We've done cases that made the New York Times, made national news.
Right.
And if you make the New York Times, then you're also going to be getting a lot of attention. But usually, if it was just my voice, that's not usually enough. A couple of times it has been. But you have to bring in the advocacy community. You have to bring in churches. You have to bring in lawyers. You have to get the media involved. And all of that is somewhat serendipitous. You just sort of hope that one thing will lead to another. And so that's kind of the way things have worked out.
What role would a church have in, you just went through a list of important entities to get involved. Those all make total sense to me. And it makes some sense to me because of what I know about church. But what does church have to do with it?
Yeah. Well, we have found, now, we do not restrict ourselves on principle to people of color. I'm quite open to representing a white person, but it just so happens that everybody who reaches out to me happens to be African American or Hispanic. And most of these people, as you probably know, the Black community is much more plugged into their churches than white people are typically. And all of these people, even if they have been very poor and underprivileged and somewhat desperate and moving in kind of shady circles in many cases, almost of necessity because that's the world they live in, they usually have some connection with the church. They may not go every week, but they've got a preacher. And so the first thing you have to do is find out what their support community is and try to get those people involved. And that has placed us in some of the most interesting congregational settings. These little country Black churches, it's like stepping back into the 1950s. I mean, it's really interesting. And you have to learn to be very flexible because they know their world and you don't, and they don't know your world. And so you have to adapt to the way they do things, the way they think about things, and try to get the religious community on board. In Jena, Louisiana, where we had the 6 boys that I told you about earlier, we had every 2 weeks, I would drive from Arlington out to Jena, which is a 6-7 hour drive. And we would have meetings in a little Baptist church. And we would try to get other pastors involved. The degree of intimidation was pretty high because they all had to function in a white controlled environment. But, you talk to them and get to know them. And the fact that I was a Baptist minister really helped in that connection. Most of the people in the advocacy community, if they had any connection with the church, It had been kind of negative. A lot of them had baggage. They didn't know they didn't know the Bible. They didn't know how to talk Christian lingo. They didn't know the songs. They didn't know the hymn. They didn't know anything. And so I was often in a position where I could minister to people, sometimes by praying with them, leading a service, reaching out, and things of that sort, which was a little unusual because unfortunately, most of the people in the criminal justice reform community are pretty secular and would tend to see Christians through the lens of the religious right, because those are the folks who have been holding the microphone for the last quarter century. And so that can create some misunderstandings, and you have to be doing a lot of explaining. But I sort of saw myself as an interlocutor between the secular advocacy world and the religious world that these people operate in. Fortunately, within most Black churches, there is an appreciation for the civil rights movement and criminal justice reform. Even if they don't talk about it on Sunday morning, it's something they care about. Yes, Don, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Don.
Two things. One is just a clarification. Early on, Doug, you made a comment about Baptist News Global and thinking that might be connected to the American Baptist churches, and there really isn't any connection between those two groups. Alan can give you a little bit more history. I've been a reader of that group for at least 10 or 12 years, send them a little bit of money every once in a while. So, Alan, can you kind of give us a little bit of a history on the Director Mark and how this has evolved out of mostly from Southern Baptist folks that left?
Yeah, there is no formal connection between Baptist News Global and the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, which is the largest group that split off from the Southern Baptist Convention. But most of the writers and most of the readers of the online magazine are part of the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. As most of your readers may know, in the 1980s, there was a massive attempt on the part of the fundamentalist wing within the Southern Baptist Convention, first to take over the denomination, and then to basically conduct a witch hunt and drive all the non-fundamentalists, there weren't a lot of real liberals, but the non-fundamentalists, out of the Southern Baptist Convention. This happened while I was working on my doctorate in church history and theology at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville. Between 1989 and 1994, the process had developed to the point where they had taken over Southern Seminary, which used to be the flagship seminary of the Southern Baptist Convention and still is. And all of my professors had to leave. The people that I came to study with, after 2 years, they were all gone, and they brought in a new crew. But they still, although they were inerrantists, they believed the Bible was without error. They also believed in ordaining women. So they had to go, because that was really the issue, was the ordination of women. And so the Baptist News Global, which was originally called, I think, the Associated Baptist Press, kind of emerged as the internet kind of became central in people's lives, as a clearinghouse where people could talk about church, talk about faith, talk about politics and the interconnection between church and politics in a fairly free forum. There wasn't a lot of censorship. Nobody has ever censored anything I've written. And I think that's true for a lot of other people as well. And so I think Baptist News Global has had a gradual impact in the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, which started out as a bunch of kind of mainline, moderate Southern Baptist leaders who were used to wielding power and used to dealing with fundamentalists and being very cautious about taking a stance on anything or really speaking honestly about the Bible or their views about theology. And those folks gradually retired and moved off the scene and have now been replaced by a younger group of leaders. We recently had our assembly meeting in St. Louis, and there was such a different spirit than was true, say, a decade ago. And so I think the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship is really developing a progressive consensus. And I don't know where that's going to take us, but it's a very, very positive development. And the church we go to in Fort Worth, Texas, which is about 20 minutes from our house, has also been going through a process of development from being at one time kind of a flagship Southern Baptist big steeple church with that in 1994 purchased a $2.5 million organ, which we are now having to repair, and had a choir of 100 people and 1,200 people in worship. Well, now if we have 300, that's a good Sunday. The choir's still big and the organ is still great, but we're struggling to pay the bills, to keep the place heated and cooled. Of course, when you have an old building, there's always costs involved with just maintaining the facility. Most established churches in the Protestant main line are struggling with the same dynamics. And so if your congregation in McMinnville is having to ask some hard questions, you're not alone. That's par for the course. I don't know of any congregation that has been able to avoid that. And so
Alan,
yeah, go ahead.
I'm our church treasurer.
Yes. Say
So
no
I
more.
know. Just yesterday, last night, I attended a lecture got my notes here someplace. Oh my goodness. Let me come back to it.
That's fine,
Sure.
Don.
I'll come back to
That's
it.
fine. That's fine. And take your time to look for it. My bet is important. Man, I've got about 42 questions I'm trying to manage in my active brain to ask you, Alan. And maybe it's a gift that we don't have a ton of time, because I just say, okay, maybe 35 of those we could ask at another time, and maybe don't even need to be asked. The one that keeps coming back to me is, how has your 25 years of working, feet on the ground, in the ditch, if you will, the ditches of the criminal justice work? I can only imagine what your eyes have seen, what your ears have heard. How has this shaped your theology? And maybe we could say, maybe we could speak to that. And then if you were invited to come to a church service because somebody read something like Don and I read that you wrote, and maybe somebody listens to this podcast, and you came and the people said, just because of who you are and the work that you've done, we want you, wherever we are in the liturgical season, whatever kind of church is, we want you to preach your message. And you had to fly here, and you probably won't ever come back again. So bring what you got and give us 30 minutes of what you would want to say to a predominantly white congregation. That's a two-part question.
Well, I think the first thing that I noticed was when we moved to Tulia, we got involved in First Baptist Church, which was kind of the established congregation in Tulia. And, they'd have 350, 400 people in worship. Their pastor had been there for about 30 years. And they had a ministry. They would go into the local state jail or state prison on a monthly basis and do a service. And I got involved in that. This is before the drug sting happened. And I didn't know anything hardly at all about the criminal justice system. And so I know these people wanted to help, and they felt some compassion for people who are involved in the criminal justice system. But when the drug sting happened, I saw another side of them. And I realized that most people who are evangelical Christians, or even churches, even people who are in the main line, especially if they're white, have absolutely no clue of what it's like to grow up poor and as a person of color. And that combination in particular is significant. It's hard to be poor and white, but it's when you're poor and black, especially in a lot of these little towns. And oddly enough, most of the cases that I've been involved in have unfolded in small towns about the same size as Tulia. I don't know why that is. But anyway, I realized that the churches were theologically ill-equipped, that our theology revolves around getting saved so I can go to heaven. And then discipleship is a matter of getting other people saved so they can go to heaven. Everything is very individualistic. It's all about me and Jesus. And because we have that kind of theology, we have been unable to deal with systemic or social issues. And I think, especially in the South, that's not accidental. I think that kind of me and Jesus, I want to get born again so I can go to heaven, theology really worked well in a slave culture where the slave economy and later Jim Crow segregation were the order of the day, because it meant that there was no social component There was no social justice component. You weren't trying to change society or impact society. And so I realized that there needed to be some way of talking to people like I used to be. And I've always been, like my dad was always on the side of the little guy. He grew up in Weyburn Baptist Church in Saskatchewan, southern Saskatchewan. And his pastor was a guy named Tommy Douglas, who eventually became governor of, or premier of Saskatchewan, and then head of the New Democratic Party, the Socialist Party in Canada. He brought Medicare, the first Medicare system in North America, to Saskatchewan, and then his model went coast to coast. And he was eventually recognized as the greatest Canadian of the 20th century. And he was my dad's pastor, and he was a social gospeler right down to his boots. I mean, he had gone to the University of Chicago in the 90s and the heart of the Depression, and ended up in this little rural community about the same size as Tulia in southern Saskatchewan, and rallied the pastors and got them involved. It seems to me that white rural people were willing to embrace the New Deal in the time of Roosevelt, for instance, during the Depression, but as long as there was no racial component to it, or so long as the assistance that was being offered only applied to white people like themselves, they could embrace a progressive political vision. But as soon as that vision was primarily directed towards improving the living conditions of people of color and creating a more just and equitable and inclusive society, then that became anathema. You could really see it. And it wasn't that people went around saying, "Oh, I hate black people." They were not aware of it, but it came out, especially in the criminal justice system, a fear of black people, a stereotypical understanding that if you're a black male, you're bound to be a thug, and you're bound to be dangerous. And this kind of rhetoric still exists in most evangelical churches, and I would dare say in most mainline churches like American Baptists, Disciples of Christ, Lutheran, United Methodists, et cetera, the Episcopal Church, Presbyterian Church USA, and all of these established legacy denominations. The people have so little contact with the struggles of poor people of color that they don't know where to start. Now at Broadway, the church I'm going to in Broadway Baptist Church in Fort Worth, we have gotten involved in the local county jail, where there have been an inordinate number of deaths and very poor supervision and no accountability whatsoever. And we've been showing up at the commissioner's court, and we'll bring 20 people. We'll bring women who are like 84-year-old widows who will get up and speak about what's going on in the jail. And it's just really having a profound impact. And so I think when you have a church that is mainline, say an American Baptist congregation that is on the more liberal end of the spectrum, everybody might have a lot of compassion, a lot of empathy, but unless you can engage systemically in some justice initiative, where you're not just trying to help people, but you're confronting the system and you're making a case for justice and casting a vision of a better world, I don't really think you can turn things around. But at Broadway, we have, although a lot of good, moderate, even people who saw themselves as progressive folks have left, often going to other liberal congregations in Fort Worth. These are not conservative people, but they didn't want to have any involvement in the community. They didn't want that. They didn't mind having ministries that helped people with their issues of poverty and hunger and whatnot. But they did not want to confront the criminal justice system. They did not want to call for justice in the community of Fort Worth or the larger DFW Metroplex. That was a turnoff for them, and it struck them as just being, that's not our job description as a church. But I have come to the conclusion that congregations that get involved in the nitty-gritty, dirty work of politics on behalf of people who are impacted negatively by those systems will make alliances in communities of color and will find that their theological world is opening up. And it's not just a head trip. It's not just ideas anymore. And then the teachings of Jesus then become much more profound and much more applicable and much more helpful than they were when we were basically cloistered in our ecclesiastical bubble.
Thank you, Alan.
Well said,
Don.
Al. Yeah. So I'm ready for last night. I didn't have my notes in front of me. Didn't
Good.
want to speak. So, one of the seminaries that's connected to the ABC is Colgate Rochester. It's now called
Right.
Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School, and they're having a week of lectures. And last night, a friend of our church, Reverend Dr. Brian Henderson, was the speaker, was the lecturer. He's the executive director of the Association of Welcoming and Affirming
Mhm.
Baptists, called AWAB. And
Yes.
I know more recently that a lot of churches in your Baptist family have become active officially in AWAB. And the part I really wanted to mention, one of the core parts of his lecture was a reminder how faithful God is. In fact, the lecture for the week at the seminary is called Great is God's Faithfulness. And
Mhm.
one of the keys to Brian's comments last night as a gay person and a gay pastor is a reminder of what at least the two of us are well versed in, what are called the four fragile freedoms: Bible freedom, soul freedom, church freedom, religious freedom. And at First Baptist Church of McMinnville, when people come to learn more about the church, Senior Pastor Reverend Dr. Erica Marksbury reminds them that that is a core value of what our local church is about. And we are constantly trying to figure out, what does that mean? How are we going to be active in the community? That event last night was, well, here's the full lecture title: Baptist Freedoms and LGBTQ plus Inclusion, Moving Beyond Clobber Texts Towards Courageous Affirmation. That was his long, and it's
Yeah.
going to be available. Anybody can go out to the seminary and find that. They said that those lectures this week will be available for people to view.
Yeah. Well,
That's what I want.
that's another issue. I was thinking today that Charlie Kirk, who was tragically assassinated in Utah just a few days ago, spoke for people who really would like to live as if it was still 1950. And in 1950, of course, not only was Jim Crow segregation still in effect, and not just in the South, but to a large extent elsewhere. But if you were gay, if you're part of what we now call the LGBTQ community, you just kept your feelings and your relationships to yourself. You did not tell anyone, especially if you wanted to be involved in the church. Everything had to be in the closet, everything had to be underground. Of course, if you were experiencing gender dysphoria, you didn't talk to anybody about that. You just sucked it up and lived with it, which was a tragic situation. At Broadway, when in the 90s, when the AIDS epidemic was still a terrible thing and they didn't really have a lot of medications to meaningfully address that issue, some of the women at Broadway got involved with just ministering to AIDS patients in the hospital. They go and visit them and whatnot. And then when some of these people recovered their health and they started coming to church, and they'd show up often as couples, and they'd stand together, they'd sit together, and that was cool so long as they didn't talk about it, or the word flaunt is often used. And so we had a good contingent, and some of these people were in leadership positions, but it was just considered to be indelicate to talk about it. It was never mentioned from the pulpit. And then in 2004, it came time to have the old pictorial directory of the church updated, and some of these couples wanted to appear together as families, and that just split the congregation. We lost several hundred people over that. And then we sort of went back into a defensive posture. Don't ask, don't tell. We aren't going to talk about it, but we're happy to have you here, was kind of so we were not really affirming in any meaningful sense. And then we had our new pastor come, and Brian Price changed that. and he started talking about LGBTQ inclusion and gay rights and the struggle that people were experiencing. And again, we lost some folks, but we also gained some people, because although most of the LGBTQ folks that are part of the congregation, they see themselves as just Christians, that they just want to come and serve God and worship God and be with God's people. They don't necessarily want to hear about sexual justice issues or gender justice issues every week, but they are affirmed on a regular basis. And the same thing is true for racial justice issues. The same thing is true for the inclusion of women. And our churches had female leaders, but now we have female pastors. And the injustices that women confront on a regular basis are addressed, and we talk about it from a theological perspective. And this is so different than anything I grew up with. I'm from Canada originally, part of what was once the Baptist Union of Western Canada, which was sort of saw itself as a bridge denomination between the evangelicals and, say, the United Church of Canada and the Anglican Church of Canada, but was moving, by the time I graduated from college, was moving in a very more conservative, not fundamentalist, but conservative direction. And so when my wife and I became co-pastors in Medicine Hat, Alberta in 1980, the paycheck was only in my name. I was put into the annuity that the church, the annuity system that the denomination had. My wife was not. These little humiliations, you could call them microaggressions, I suppose, but it was just one thing after another. And so we have wrestled with that issue, and it's something that has been very healing for my wife. To see women up there ministering and for her to have a role that is not encumbered by her gender has been a beautiful thing. Younger people growing up now, an ethic that is rooted in the 1950s, it just strikes them as being bigotry and hatred. They don't like the guy who killed Charlie Kirk was reacting not only against what Kirk was saying, but against his own upbringing, I think. A lot of young people they've never experienced in their circle of friends folks who were homophobic or folks who were blatantly racist. And when they hear people talking the way Charlie Kirk routinely talked, it sounds like hate speech to them. They don't understand the nostalgia for the way things were in the 1950s, which is where Kirk is really coming from.
Yeah.
And so I think our congregations, we can't get into a celebratory mode where, aren't we great progressive people? We're so open to this group and that group and the other thing. I think that is not meaningful to people. What they want to know is, do you have a different theology, a different way of understanding what the church is, who Jesus is, what the faith is all about? The faith is not primarily about going to heaven when you die. And if you read the New Testament, it's not, but is rather about God redeeming the entire creation. How does that affect the way we do church? And those are the kinds of questions I think we need to be asking.
Yep. I know Doug is watching the clock.
Well, I'm watching the clock, but I'm saying I don't really care about the clock right now. But thank you, Don. Thank you, Don. Alan, I'm going to guess that you're not in your 40s and you're not in your 50s, and you might be in your 60s, but you might be in your 70s.
72.
You've seen a few things. Just by the amount of years that you've lived. What is this time that we're in right now in regards to what is being required now of the church? I think maybe you've already answered that, but what is required of the church? And then you said earlier that your church was having, now that you've gotten involved in the county jail work, that it was having a great impact. And I thought, yeah, it's having a great impact in the jail. And I'm assuming it's having a great impact on the body of people that get together on a Sunday morning and then throughout the week. Mm-hmm. It's a reciprocal kind of growth that's happening. What What's required of the church right now to both give and to receive back? So even if there's small numbers of people, because you and I talked earlier, and Don was part of that, that there's a decline in membership and attendance within
Mm-hmm.
mainline churches. We sure need to be concerned about that for each church in regards to them being able to exist, but
Yeah.
also for the denomination to be around when the three of us will be gone. That's
Mm-hmm.
important. But maybe we should stand aside and say, okay, we're not too concerned about numbers, even though we have to be. But we're really
Yeah.
concerned about what are we doing in regards to the contribution and what's being given back to us. What's the
Yeah.
theological crisis that you speak of? What's necessary? What needs to
Yeah.
happen more?
Well, one of the big issues that has emerged recently, and a lot of people who are never Trump conservatives, like Peter Wehner, for instance, after the assault on the Capitol building in 2021, his response was that this is a failure of catechesis, by which he meant discipleship, by which he meant training up our children in what it means to be Christian. And he was speaking from an evangelical perspective. And I think that we need to embrace an understanding of Christian discipleship that we're excited about and that we can share with our children. We need to raise our children in a self-consciously Christian way. And one of the advantages of the loss of influence and credibility, even certainly authority within, say, mainline Protestant life. Nobody even knows that a lot of these churches exist anymore. The churches that are getting all the headlines are the folks who are on board with Donald Trump, the MAGA faith, the Christian nationalism. But we need to be able to talk to our children in ways that they can understand, in ways that allow them to fall in love with Jesus and want to be his disciples and his representatives and his ambassadors, and want to build a community that is rooted in that kind of love and that kind of passion. And most of us, because we grew up in churches that had this highly individualistic understanding of salvation, don't know how to talk that language. Unfortunately, a lot of people are in congregations that are purple. Half the people voted for Harris and half people voted for Trump. And so you don't talk about politics. And half the people are basically evangelical in their theology and other people are not. They may be liberal in some way, or they just may be atheological. And so the preacher gets up and he's or she is very, very cautious about what they say about anything of importance. And I think we need to get to the point where we can simplify our theology. The folks who are talking about alternatives to, say, fundamentalism or evangelical theology tend to speak in a kind of bafflegab that is not intelligible to the average person. And so we have to be able to express our faith in biblical language that is in touch with the Christian tradition, because we haven't always been evangelicals. We need to be rooted in the early church and in the fathers and mothers of the first centuries of the church. We have to learn from Roman Catholics, and we need to learn from the Black church. We need to be open to all of these folks and be in dialogue with people in the Jewish community, Muslims. A lot of these folks really want to talk, but they don't feel they're in a position to start the conversation. And it's not as if we're going to agree with everybody. We're not. But we present ourselves as followers of Jesus. And we believe that Jesus is redeeming the whole world and that God has embraced the whole world, that God loves everyone. And so we're there trying to embody individually and corporately that kind of a God, that kind of a love. And who knows where it'll take us. But when we can preach that kind of a theology week in and week out, we can teach it to our children, when we can incorporate it into a catechism, something that we share with our young people, with our children, when we can translate it into terms that a 5-year-old could understand, but also be able to take the insights of people like Walter Brueggemann, for instance, his name came up earlier, and incorporate those into the way we understand the Bible and the faith. Speaking of Brueggemann, it's interesting. He always took pride in the fact that he could go to conservative churches and liberal churches and basically give the same message and be accepted. If you were to stand, and now that he's gone, but when he was alive, if you had sat him down and put his feet to the fire and say, do you believe there was a literal exodus, or do you believe that this miracle that's in the Old Testament actually happened? He would probably say, that is the story we have received. Whether it happened or not, I don't know.
Correct.
But this is the narrative. This is the story that we have received. And what sense do we make of it?
And I knew Walter personally, and I know Walter would say, there's always a captivity. There's always a need for exodus.
That's right.
So the essence of the story is it just happens to be told this way, which is in cinematic form. Boy, does it get our attention about the parting of the sea. So it breaks us open to, we are held captive by empire and we need to be released. And we're as captive as anybody. I mean, the reading I've been doing and just the reflecting I've been doing is continuing to say, how has all this shaped me and what do I need to get an exodus from? But I also know that when I get too full of that, then I hear the stories of oppression. And we know the story of Trey Reed at Delta State University, who was found hanging from a tree. And I want to ask you, Alan, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I can only imagine how your eyes and ears hear and read that story and what you know about those kinds of spaces. As I listened to the attorney for the family this morning saying, we need answers. According to this morning, nobody from Delta State University had even reached out to the family.
Yes, they learned about it through the media.
They learned about it through the media.
I have done presentations at Delta State University.
Wow.
We had a woman who was in her 80s who had been the right-hand person of Fannie Lou Hamer back in the 1960s. And she and I would get up and I'd get my guitar out and we'd sing these old freedom songs, that they sang during the civil rights movement. I was leading a civil rights tour through the Delta, and we were cooperating with some people from the University of Florida. And so I know that campus really well. But I also know Cleveland, Mississippi really well, and it is a conservative town. It's part of the Old South. And so I've done a lot of reading about the Mississippi Delta and the civil rights movement in the Mississippi Delta because Curtis Flowers, the person I was trying to help in Winona, which is just up the hill from the Delta, was being held in the Parchman Plantation prison in that area. And so we spent a lot of time in motels in Cleveland. And when I heard the local authorities say, we think he did it to himself, at first I thought that ain't happening. And then they found another person, a homeless person who had been lynched or found hanging in Vicksburg, which is just down the road on the Mississippi River. And so this is very disturbing. But you can see why white people living in Mississippi would not be able to relate to this, because they know what happened during those days. They know that their own prosperity is rooted in injustice. They don't want to talk about it. And when a Black person is found hanging on the campus of the university, it really threatens everyone. And so that case, it made me want to jump in the car and go and research it, but I'm not in a position to do that right now. To talk to the family. But fortunately, I think they have folks who are doing that for them, so I don't need to be there. But there is a deeper story that will emerge from that situation. And what it is, I have no idea.
Yeah.
Well,
with a few minutes left, Don, anything that you want to say or ask? We have time.
Again, Alan, I just want to say I'm so appreciative of the way you have both stood for justice and you've befriended those who are at the end receiving the injustice. That's the Jesus way. That's what I'm about. I'm constantly trying to figure out what can I do to be faithful to my call as a lay leader.
Right.
And, so thank you.
Yeah, when we're excited about our faith and we're unapologetic about it, And when we don't feel the need to be fussing and fighting with people who disagree with us in the religious community or the secular community, I think that really frees us up to not worry about the fact that we're not making budget, or at least not be so focused on that fact that we cannot celebrate the love of God in worship. And I think it frees us up to not, I think our churches need to get in a position where we see ourselves as kind of like Israel in exile in Babylon, where the temple has been destroyed and thousands of people have been unjustly killed and we've been dragged off, and our whole identity is in shambles. Our whole religion has been torn apart. And the exciting thing is that now we can put it back together, and God can tell us how to do that. So there's a potential for rebirth, because what we know as Judaism came out of the Babylonian captivity. It had a lot more to do with the Babylonian captivity, I'm starting to realize, than it did with anything else. And even the way they told those old stories about the exile and captivity in Egypt, those stories were shaped by the experience of exile. And so I think we need to see that we're in a new exile. This is going to be a time of trial and tribulation for the churches, for sure. But I think it's also the opportunities for rebirth and exciting new experiences corporately and individually of faith, and seeing faith as an adventure, are much greater now than they were when I was a boy. And that pleases me greatly, even though the prospects for the institutional churches are dim and daunting. The prospects for the flourishing of faith, I think, are much better than they were when I was a boy.
Well said. Well said. Well said. Well said. Well said. Boy, I sense a joy in you, and my imagination can only imagine what you've been through, what you've seen. It would be so easy to be so jaded. I don't mean to be a therapist in this session, but I don't sense jadedness. There's a joy in you, and that's living proof of something you got a hold of, and Don and I are part of that.
Well, I sense the same thing in you.
Well, thank you. And it's in Don. I'd like to give you a gift. The gift is this. I don't know if you've read Walter Brueggemann's biography that was written by Conrad Carnegie. It was written about a lot of research in sitting with Walter when he was first asked, and this is in the book. It was written, I think it was published in 2024, maybe late 23. I think 24. I mean, I knew Walter, and I've read so much of Walter, and I've read the book 3 times now.
Wonderful.
Because Conrad approached Walter, and Walter's famous book, or the most famous book, popular book, is The Prophetic Imagination. Well, this is called Walter Brueggemann's Prophetic Imagination, because what Conrad said is people need to hear the story of how this has come to be in you. How has this come to be in you? And so it starts from his birth, and it just goes through how this has worked itself in, because we know how he's attempted or has worked it into the world, but how did it work itself in you? And he said, Walter, this is like a map, and I want to be like a cartographer. I want to do cartography, I think it's called. I want to map your story. And Walter said, it's in the book. Walter says, I don't really know why you'd want to do that, because my life has not been very interesting. Well, that was the modesty and humility of Walter. I'm trying to get Conrad. He and I are right now in dialogue, early dialogue, to try to get him on the podcast. And I've got somebody else that would join us, like Don's joined us today. But the gift I'd like to give you is that, because I was thinking earlier, how many Alan Beans are there in the world? I don't know, but there's not enough. And how many Alan Beans are in the church? I don't know, but there's not enough. So I would hope that somebody who had research skills and would be a good writer would tell your story about how, because this needs to live on into the next generation, of how this is, whatever this is, and I think we could put words to it, how this has gotten a hold of you. You know, what drew you and Nancy in Tulia, Texas, to give a rat's ass about what was happening? But you stepped into it, and man, the 25 years. So I guess we'd read this as Alan Bean's, I don't know how we'd finish that out, criminal justice path, or I don't know how we'd finish that out. Yeah, there needs to be somebody, maybe it'll be Dawn or somebody else that we'll find for you. But I'm kind of joking, but I'm really not. I think the story needs to be told, because There needs to be a legacy here. There'll be a legacy of your work, but there needs to be more Alan Beans, because I mean, how many individuals are sitting in prison, people of color and even white people, that are innocent as the day is long. It's heartbreaking, and you know that better than anybody. So thank you for this time. Thank you for investing this. I think Don and I are going to be really proud to be able to get the news out to our congregation to watch this. And then we'll see where else it goes. And you can send it anywhere you would like, but there's no pressure to do so. Thank you for today.
Yeah.
It's been a gift.
Well, thank you for reaching out. I really appreciate it.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
great talking to you.
Thank you, Alan. And would you be open to coming back sometime?
Sure.
Fantastic. Please, when I hit this stop recording, please stay with us. The audience won't hear, but we'll know that everything is uploaded, because if you pop off too soon, we'll lose just about everything. And that would be really, really, really tragic. So hang in there. Thanks again for everybody listening. It's been a rich time, and we're grateful for you, Alan. Thank you. God bless you and keep you safe. All right.